Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Swati Teerdhala. I am a YA author, and today we're going to be speaking with three amazing YA authors as well. So welcome. Before we begin, I just want to let everyone know that there will be books by the authors in this panel outside, and you can purchase them from the Center for Fiction, right outside the venue, and there will be a signing right after this panel. So just an FYI. So let's jump in. First of all, I just want to go down and introduce everyone, or have everyone introduce themselves as we start this When Worlds Collide panel. Dustin, do you mind kicking it off?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin Thao. I live here in New York, in Flatiron, only for 3 years, so I'm new. I'm the author of You've Reached Sam, and my second book, When Haru Was Here, came out this month. So it's been a lot of fun.
Woo!
Hi, my name is Camille Gomera-Tavarez. I'm a Dominican-American author. I currently live in Philly, but I was born in the Bronx and grew up nearby in Jersey. And my debut book came out in 2022 and won a Pura Belpré Silver Award, which is called High Spirits. It was a short story collection. And then my second book came out earlier this year in February. It's my first full-length novel, so it was definitely an experience to write it. But it's called The Girl with the Ring and the Baseball Bat, and it is a high school YA with some magic thrown in. But yeah, that's me.
Hello, my name is Amélie Wen Zhao. I also live in New York in the Columbus Circle area, but I'm from Beijing. I am the young adult fantasy author of Song of Silver, Flame Like Night, and the upcoming The Scorpion and the Night Blossom.
And just to round it out, I'm also from New York, or I live here, been here for a while. Happy to be here for the Brooklyn Book Fest. And I am the author of The Boy from Wish and the Tiger at Midnight series. Okay, let's jump right in. So the title of this panel is called When Worlds Collide. My question for all of you is, how do you approach blending fantasy and reality when it comes to world building? What are some of the key challenges that you face and frameworks you use? Anything of the sort? Let us into your mind.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I feel like when thinking about this question, for me, I sort of dove into this writing style from a magical realism class that I took in college, and I feel like that really informed my approach most of the time. So it was less about blending two worlds together, even though that's the title of this panel, and more about just finding the magical and the surreal parts of actual everyday real life. So especially for High Spirits, most of those stories were pretty autobiographical and based on stories that my family had told me growing up, and my grandma would say that my dad was possessed as a child, and my dad would just wander off. So it's just thinking about stories that you have, because I feel a lot in this world is not explainable. There's scientists don't know what everything always is, and I feel that's just reality. So it's looking for those little pockets of reality that are a little bit magical and trying to pull from that and make that a little bit bigger. But yeah, that's my approach.
To go off of that, because I also write contemporary with magical realism. I think for me, so my stories, they're contemporary because they take place in the contemporary world. With Sam, it's in a small town in Washington, which is not far from where I grew up. And my second book, Haru, takes place in Chicago, where I happened to be living at the time I was writing it. But I always like stories that are a little bit more special and a little bit bigger and more exciting. And that's the things that I try to bring into my stories. And with Sam, for example, Sam is a story about a girl who calls her boyfriend who passed away and he answers the phone. And Haru's story about the perfect guy walks to the coffee shop and sits down next to you, but no one else can see him. So it's very imaginative, And I personally like to think these things happen all of the time, right? Especially when, Mercury's in retrograde. So that's kind of how I operate under. And I try to make it, I take realistic approaches, and I want people to think that, wow, this is I believe this, and to really buy into it. And do you guys know that there's this TikTok trend right now where, I don't know if some of you guys must have seen it, where it's like, do you have a story that you've never told anyone because just no one would believe it, right? And I feel like that's kind of the vibe that I want. And because some things just like don't have explanations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And an example for me, I had this was actually a couple of days ago in my apartment building. So there's this guy who lives in the building, and I've met him once over a year ago, and we had this conversation on the elevator, and I've never seen him since. And I completely never thought about him. And a couple days ago, I was, as I do, go down the elevator, and it stops at a random floor, and it pops into my head, and I go, that's him, isn't it? The door's open, and it's him. So it's just one of those strange things, So my approach is always to make things, these strange phenomenons, like, don't have explanations, and I focus on kind of the emotional core of them. So with something like You've Reached Sam, is that I don't really focus on how the calls work, but more so what they would say to each other and what the conversations are about.
I love what you both said, because I feel like we write in very different genres. Like, I'm in second world fantasy, but I feel like whether you're in a contemporary real life setting or a second world, reading is a door. You guys are on the other side of the door looking into a fantasy world, and I'm on this side of the door looking into a reality. And I think tying it together, I try to always place these anchors that kind of unite us as human beings. So what do we all look for in books, right? There are universal things like food, clothing, architecture, structure, societies that everyone's going to identify with. And I try to place them into a second world fantasy so that readers can find little specks of them. Like, I feel like there's a reason a lot of fantasy books have, marketplaces, the characters just walking along the streets and they see all the colorful foods and tarps and everything. Those are some of my favorite scenes in fantasy because I can just go into that world. So I feel like the anchors are really what root us into the reality as a fantasy author. And likewise, I find like magic in the ordinary. So there's this, I used to go to my grandma's courtyard house every Sunday back in Beijing, and she would tell me like really weird stories. Like, she had this little altar for Guanyin Pusa, the goddess of mercy, and then there's like this little jade pendant sitting there. I would wear that, and then one day she got so mad at me, and she said, that jade pendant is cursed. Like, you're going to die, like, if you touch that again. So you better put it back, and you better pray to the gods that they grant you like mercy. So that jade pendant stayed with me throughout the years because as a kid you believe it. I'm just like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. The gods don't like me now. And it made its way into my book, Song of Silver Flame Like Night. So I feel like it's finding the magic in these everyday things that really make it into your books and anchor the experience as a reader, whether it's coming from contemporary and real life settings or second world fantasy. And Swati, you've written in both, so I'd love to hear your experience on it.
Ooh, yes, I have written epic fantasy and also romantic comedy. It is really about finding those touchstones. I think that's very true. What feels real, regardless of where you are. Ultimately, we're all humans, unless you're writing like an alien fantasy, which I don't do. But even then, there is a familiarity that you need to have in your writing because we, as readers, are all humans. We all have a human experience. So I think it's really that more than anything. I want to ask really quickly, Camille, do you have a story from your childhood? And do not mean to put you on the spot here, but now that we've already heard two other ones.
Yeah, I feel like, especially for High Spirits, I pulled like a lot, and like I did one interview with another like Latin American magical realism author, and she was just like, which of these stories like did you feel was more you? And then she said, was it this story? And I was just like, yes, this was a memoir that I just changed all the names for. But yeah, I mostly think about like just, yeah, like I was mentioning before, like my grandmother telling me stories about how my my father would like get possessed as a child, and he would kind of just like wander off and like walk away. And like one day there was like a festival on the street, and he started going like the opposite direction, and then he came back. And there's a similar story in the book. And then when he came back, like she like had to do this whole like ceremony and stuff to like get the demon out of it. So like when she was telling me the story, she was like bragging about how like he wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for me, and like all this stuff about how she like saved his life, and that kind of thing. But my grandma was like a community like healer. And she had like this giant book of like just like medicines and potions and stuff that, you know, they worked like most of the time. Like if you were sick with like a cold or anything, or you had any like a headache or any sort of ailment, she would just like put something together, and like it wasn't like, you know, medicine like you'd get from the doctor, and it was usually something with onion and something really disgusting, but it would always work, and you just had to like make that bargain. Do you want to eat the disgusting thing and keep like your sickness, or do you want to, you know, push through and be cured? But yeah.
So basically be on your guard against grandmas and random men in elevators.
All the time.
I will say he was cute.
Okay, cool. So we've kind of covered world building. Of course, we're not done there, but I want to dive a little bit more into when you're creating these worlds with either a hint of magic or with a lot of magic. How do you think about the world or character, or putting it all together in a way that explores themes that are like universal, such as grief, such as love, such as retribution, self-discovery, which is a very YA thing. How do you think about these themes when it comes to your worlds?
So again, yeah, I feel like that's probably like the most important part when I was trying to like get started into like writing the novel. Like I had like a little, you know, vision board, and I just had like an index card, and I just like wrote like rage, sisterhood, and like that was like my North Star for like, okay, anything that like I'm wanting to write or any ideas I'm having, like how do those relate to like these things, and how can I, you know, push those out. I feel like that's helpful to have, like, because you can get kind of lost like as a writer and like not knowing what direction to take things in. But yeah, I feel like you were saying before, like everything has to have that anchor, you know, like a monster is not just a monster. Like I think Ursula Le Guin said that. But yeah, all of like the elements of the story, like just trying to make sure that they tie back to like the point that you're trying to make about like humanity, about emotions. In my case, about like my experience in high school and like how, you know, corruption and an establishment worked in my mind as a 16-year-old, just within like the school systems and that kind of thing. So yeah, definitely some like research and things like that to like help make sure that those things tie into like real life so that people really get them. But yeah, I think always just like having a North Star of making sure that every single little element, every magical object that, you know, the kids find all relates to that one goal.
So my stories are known to be sad, if you guys don't know this. A lot of the themes I like to explore are grief and loss and loneliness. And I think one of the reasons why I choose to write through magical realism is it allows us to ask and answer questions we wouldn't be able to otherwise. And because, you know, we learn to think of life in a different light. And a great example I can think of is They Both Die at the End from Adam Silvera. I think it's very popular for a reason, because it asks us the question of, if you had one day left to live, how would you spend it? And just hearing the question itself, like, you have this emotional resonance to it. And if I had to pin down my own books into questions, I think Sam at the very core, I think the reason why I think readers pick it up is it asks us this question about, if we had a chance to speak with someone we've loved and lost, what would we say? And for Haru, you know, it also is magical. It's a story about falling in love with someone who isn't there. And the question that through this kind of exploration, I think the question like that book is trying to ask is, if we knew we'd be gone tomorrow, what would we leave behind to be remembered by? And I think that I always try to look for like that emotional core when it comes to my stories through this type of like strange, bizarre, magical phenomenon. And I remember Haru was actually one of the hardest books I had to write. And the first person that got to read it was, of course, my agent at the time. And I remember I sent it to her, she read it, we got on the call, and she was crying. And she said, she kind of understood the question that the book was asking. And she's like, as a mother, like, it made me think about my kids. It made me think about what I could do now to she says, of course, anything could happen, right? And it made her think, what can she do now to make it feel as if she was always here? And I think it's those types of, that's what I like to write into my stories, and that's why I explore them in the way that I do.
Yeah, I love both of those answers. I think for me, in building a second world fantasy, the world always serves the character, because I think we read to get the universal human experience. We read to feel something, right? Whether it's, looking at corruption of the world or grief and loss. And for me, when I was writing Song of Silver, Flame Like Night, I had a scene. It was the character dressed in ancient Chinese robes, and she was singing, but it was such a sad song. And there was like a cold, lonely beauty to the whole scene. So I started asking questions, and I was like, what kind of world is she in? Why is she so sad? What is the history? What is her history within the confines of this world? And how is she going to navigate the structure of this world and the magic system to make a certain choice or to develop? And I think it's when the world and the character, excuse the pun, but collide, that's when we get to see, what makes us human. Because even though I write in second world, these emotions are very much human, whether there's love and loss and romance and, there's generational grief within song. There's, the exploration of imperialism from within and without. And all of these are just, I think, universal to a lot of us. And I think it's when in fantasy, these stakes are super blown up, right? They're not like, it's not set in a high school, but it's equally penetrative to the human experience. So these stakes are blown up. There are demon gods. There are worlds that are going to be destroyed if they don't make certain, decisions. And when the characters are put at the crux of these, when the worlds collide for them, then that's when we see the universal experience of what kind of a choice would I make if I were the character in this situation.
Yeah, I love that. I would also add, when I think about epic fantasy in particular, just to be the other epic fantasy person here, I also think about a question in the world that I'm building, one that's inherent. The way I like to think about magic in general is asking, what if? So in that what if, there are so many what ifs that occasionally they might be, what if the sky was purple? But most of the time they have more meaning than that. They're a question you may have been asking your whole life in the back of your head. One that you just don't have an answer to, but you want to explore. And magic and fantasy, all of this, all these little things, building a new world helps you kind of take those first steps to exploration. Okay. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts a little bit next. When you think about adding magic into your world, when you're thinking about these worlds colliding, we're going to keep using that throughout this panel, do you put rules on yourself, or how do you think about the magic? How do you think about incorporating it? And just walk us through a little bit more of the actual writing process when it comes to that.
Sure. So, yeah, thinking of this and thinking of your question of what if, I feel like that's also a similar way that I try to think of things when I'm in the process of writing. And I think that's why I love magic as a reader and as a writer, because I feel when you step into a blank page, it's I can make anything. Why would I make a boring story about just someone going to work and coming back, or there's always those boring white guy stories that he hates his wife, and that's what we would have to read in writing classes. Why would I write that when the world is my oyster and I could write about whatever I can imagine. So I feel like that's also like why I'm gravitated to this. But in thinking of like rules and things like that, I'm more of like just, I love chaos. I love it so much. I love mess. I love chaos. And I also feel like that was kind of helpful for me to sort of like let go, and like I didn't go to like, you know, I don't have an English degree. I didn't like have formal education in like how to approach writing a novel. So I was kind of just making it up as I went along. And I feel like that thinking granted me a lot more freedom in terms of like, when I would think those what if questions, like I was like, what if? Because at first I was just writing it from like a first person perspective of like the main character Rosie, and I was just like, oh, I really like this other character Zeke, and then I added in her sister, and all of them, well, the first like Rosie and like her sister were based off like a comic strip that like I made in college because I went to art school. So like that, those like evolution of those characters, eventually I was like, what if I wrote from all three perspectives, and I just like rotated them. I was like, that seems like a lot of work, but then I was like, okay. But whatever like I encountered a what if that like excited me, that was sort of the direction I would take in terms of like trying to come up with like the structure and like the rules for everything. So like that excited me. So I was just like, okay, I'm gonna do that. And people often ask me like, why did you make that decision? I feel like also coming as a short story writer, having the freedom to like not just be in one voice and one perspective was something that was probably more natural to me. And yeah, I feel like, I don't know, like I was saying before, like the world that we live in doesn't really have a lot of concrete rules, even though humans try to make them, however arbitrary they may be. So I kind of like, you know, leaving certain things like open-ended. Some people don't like reading those kinds of things. I love reading books where I'm just like, I don't know where I am, I don't know what's going on, I don't know what's happening, but that's just sort of me. So I try to like just go with that instinct, and I feel like usually like my emotions and like those instincts are what guide me in terms of like rules and that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm sure you'll have different answers.
Yeah, when I build my magic systems, I go in with the intention of, you know, what are the themes I'm going to be exploring in this book, and how does the system that I choose, how does the magic that I choose play into these themes? How does the character use the magic, and how does it impact them, and what consequences do they have? So with Song of Silver Flame Like Night, which is a parallel to what the West calls China's Century of Humiliation, when, you know, the Allied forces and the Japanese basically went into the country and took parts of the land. A lot of it is an exploration of power and why people want it, how it corrupts. It interrogates the idea of a benevolent ruler. Like, if they have all this power, who's to say when they're benevolent, right? In the case of an emperor. There are two systems of magic, one key one in Song, which is the Hin, or the parallel to the Chinese people. It's very much rooted in kind of the harmony and balance and peace of certain religious principles that I grew up in. And it's used as a kind of way of life. It's a way of thought. So it's not used in any sort of violent means in that setting. Whereas with the colonizers in the book, they have used one single branch of magic related to metal, and they've perfected it to science. And that was meant to represent kind of how certain nations have industrialized, and they've developed all these weapons to use in war. So those different systems of magic, when they come and they collide, that's when you get all these really interesting themes and this conflict. And yeah, so I use those to really interrogate my world, and kind of add some fun flares. Like the what if I asked in my book was like, what if, you know, there are these 4 demon gods that were all powerful. As long as you had ties to one, you can, you know, bring down the world. But what if with every time you use their power, they demand you to sacrifice souls to them, and you slowly lose pieces of your mind until you're consumed by them whole? How far would you go to obtain that power?
So I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know the rules to my own stories. It's like, what rules, you know? I honestly had this conversation, I think just last week, where it was kind of like a business meeting about Haru, and someone had just asked, wait, like, how does Haru show up like that? And I was like, why are you asking me? Like, I just don't know. And the truth of the matter is, like, when you write in the contemporary, and to stay in the contemporary, you can't move too far out of it. When you begin to explain, when you begin to add a lot of rules, there's a balance you have to make, right? Because you can begin to move into science fiction or fantasy or even to the paranormal. So there's kind of like a delicate dance to it. And I will say, for my first book, You've Reached Sam, probably the question I get asked the most, I get DMs about, people approach me, is, you didn't explain how this works. And the thing about it is, like, I understand the question. Of course, like, how did Sam pick up the phone? How are they speaking to each other, right? And I will say that might have been one of your questions at the Q&A, you know, because I get them at every Q&A. And so the thing about it is, I understand the question, of course, because if I was to like close my eyes and kind of be in Julie's shoes, and to imagine calling up someone that I've lost and having them answer, of course I'm going to ask, how is this possible, right? But the truth is, like, in my realistic approach to these type of stories is, when I'm really thinking about it, I think the question of how isn't the most important question. To me, it's not even the second most important question. If I was to truly put myself in this scenario, I think the most important question I would want to know is this really you? And if so, and the second one would be, if so, how long do we have? If I know the answers to these things, then it doesn't matter how any of this is possible. I'm just happy to hear your voice again. And so it goes back to like focusing on the emotional core of the story, and that sometimes in these worlds, there are no explanations to it.
And I would just like add in, like, just like we were saying before about magical realism, I feel like that's your question of like not knowing how things work. It's like one of the core tenets of magical realism, and what I feel like a lot of things get labeled magical realism that aren't really. But for me, I always found that magical realism is when something, you know, unexplained is happening, and the characters themselves aren't asking like why or how. They're just kind of like going with it, and that's what I like loved the most about it, because I'm just like, yeah, I'm here on this ride. I just have my hands up, like we're just like going on it, and I feel like it's a very non-Western sort of way of like storytelling, of just like accepting that the magic is happening, and you don't really need like much more explanation than that. But yeah,
I think that all of your answers were phenomenal. What I really heard here, which I found really interesting, is it seems like with the magical realism, there's a sense of wonder. Mm-hmm. And part of wonder is not really asking why, it's just being wondrous, which I think is really cool. Coming from a epic fantasy background, we talk a lot more about what are the rules of magic, how do you make sure it makes sense so that it feels like the real world. But why would you want the real world? Maybe that's the question we should be asking. Very cool. We are one question away from opening up questions to everyone, so please think about if you have any questions, get yourself prepared. My last question is just really, when you think about your characters, I think a couple of times it's been mentioned, you know, all of this, the way you think about all these is very thematic. You know, world building, you know, the rules, all of it is usually to answer a question or to explore a theme. So how do your characters fit into that? And just tell me a little bit about your main character. You all have more than one main character, but try and pick one maybe.
So the question is how our characters fit into kind of the themes.
How do you think about character building within exploration of themes?
Ooh. When I start thinking about my characters, I think about books as, at least the ones I write, as like a change, right? There's always going to be something that changes in their lives, an inciting incident. And that's when kind of the magic starts, right? With my character, I started building them as, you know, what is their everyday ordinary? What do they want? What are their fears? What kind of a background do they come from? And why do they want what they want or fear what they want? And then I think when the inciting incident happens, and when, for example, in Song of Silver Flame Like Night, when the long-lost magic comes and finds the character in the form of a hot young magician, that's when her whole life changes, and she realizes that, all the lives that have been lost in her kingdom, the family that she's lost, the magic that she thinks is lost, and the legacy that she thinks has been taken away from her, all of that is possible if she can just learn the skills and start to fight back. So what does she want? What does she fear? And how does that come into conflict with the series of events that happens throughout the book? That's how I think about character.
So for me, as a writer, I love to write from my own experiences, because I think it's always best to write from what you know and what is true in your own life. And an example I can give, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, parts of myself always find their way into the characters. An example I can give is with Haru. Haru's very messy first draft. Right, it was rough. I didn't really know what the book was about. And when I sent it to my editor, and she basically said, nice try, but here's everything that's wrong with it. But there's one particular scene that I absolutely love. And I think you have to keep this one scene and go from there. And then it just so happens to be a scene that happened in my own life, that may have been with another boy, and I was just like, oh my God, of everything, it was also something that I didn't really want to write either. I kind of just did it to process the moment, right? Because I think I was grieving the loss of a friendship at the same time. And my editor, so I was like, oh my God, that scene of everything. And I was like, can I be completely honest with you? Like, that's real. Like, that happened to me. She says, Dustin, I know. And I was like, what are you talking about? She says, Dustin, I've been doing this for a very long time. And I know when something is real. And I was just like, God, please don't tell anyone, okay? So back to this book of Haru, what I like to do with my characters, like selfishly, is I like to let them explore things that I don't get to do, right? So like in both books, it's like there's a theme of like traveling to Japan, or the desire to go to Japan, which it's like if there's one place I need to go, it's there, and I haven't gone yet, but my characters have. And I got to write for Eric and Haru. They got to spend like the perfect day together in Japan. Like I had this whole itinerary. And it's an entire chapter, and that's how, like, something I would like. And when I wrote about Eric living in Chicago, I was in Chicago at the same time. And to be very honest, I didn't want to write about Chicago. I wanted to write about New York because that's where I wanted to go, So, but then, and I didn't like Chicago because it was during the pandemic, and I didn't have any friends. Because I just moved there for school. And obviously we weren't allowed to see anyone, everything was closed, so I would just take these very long walks all throughout Chicago, exploring, and that was my way of kind of exploring the city. And I got to see things for the first time. I got to see the Bean, and I would say, like, I would get in like 30,000 steps, guys, a day, just because like I had nothing to do. I mean, I was supposed to work on my book, but I would, you go on walks instead for inspiration, and that's how I got to learn about the city. And one of my favorite places I got to pass was the Chicago Theater, because it had that famous Chicago sign. It's like, I just love that sign because it was always on, and I would walk there sometimes at night, and it felt like alive. And I just remember thinking, I want Eric to work here. And there's a funny story to this, but I think we're probably out of time. But so me walking around the Riverwalk, like I walked through the Riverwalk thinking, wow, what a great place to go on a date. And I've never got to take anyone there on a date, but my character did. And so me walking through the pandemic alone in the city, a brand new city to me, you have I feel like we have a lot of these imaginary experiences, and sometimes I imagine someone there with me. And that kind of found its way into Eric finding Haru and showing him around and being his little tour guide of Chicago.
It's very cute. Yeah, I mean, I related to a lot of that, especially like, you know, I feel like it's very hard to find like what your story is about. I feel like that's like a very like core thing. Like, okay, I can write like a bunch of like dialogue or about things that happen to me, but like, what is this actually at its core about? And I feel like for me, with The Girl, the Ring, and the Baseball Bat, I definitely found that through starting to write about, you know, adults in my academic life who were like frustrating against me, and like realizing why these things were happening, both as a girl, as like a Black girl and Latina girl, with the ways that like certain, you know, teachers and stuff would talk to me. Which is funny because I got like one review for the book that was like, all of like the, you know, the adults are painted cartoonishly like evil, and I was like, every single dialogue piece with like the adults are coming from like things that, you know, people have said to me in real life, especially like the principal character in the book. So that was very therapeutic for me, and it was very like also therapeutic for me to listen to the audiobook and like to like listen to like this character, you know, stand up for herself in a way that like I wasn't able to at the time. So yeah, I think definitely coming from that was like a big way to like get to character building, especially for Rosie being one of the main characters. So the story like rotates through 3 different perspectives of Rosie, Zeke, and Caro. And for each of them, I definitely like worked, you know, on the characters first, and then worked on like what their magic was going to be from that. And it was again another like what if thing. I was like, what if? Because at first only like Rosie had magic, and the idea was that she had this magical jacket that made people do like whatever she said to do. Which coming from that was like, okay, what kind of like girl is she? She's probably very controlling, a Virgo. You know, she's like a Capricorn in most of her placements. There's a lot of astrology in the book. They get into it, but yeah. So being like that type A type of student, which I was definitely like in high school, you know, that has like all of this, you know, she's definitely very smart and capable, but like the things that are in her way are all of this like bureaucracy and school and like outside forces that she's just coming to realize and coming of age into. So it was like, what if, you know, she didn't have that in her way? What if she had the powers to actually do all of the things that she wanted to do? What would she do with that, and what might be, you know, the downsides of like her having all of this power? And then going into Zeke, he's kind of like this, I'm a Pisces, he's a Pisces. He's this lover boy character. He's like just this little sad Black Jamaican Caribbean boy who just moved to Jersey City, so he's the new kid in town. But he just like is just falling in love with like every boy and every girl in like the school. For Zeke, I was like just at a thrift shop with a friend, and like we saw this ring that was just like very weird and scary looking, and it had like a face molded onto it, and I was like, that ring is possessed. Like it just has powers. There's an energy coming from it. Like someone put a curse on that ring. So I had that idea of like just these rings, and like Zeke already being a character that liked fashion and jewelry. So that seemed to like match up with him as well. But also like him emotionally, he's dealing with a lot of like grief. His mother and grandmother have just passed away. So like the rings sort of make him like a Cupid character that can manipulate, you know, romantic relationships with other people, not so much with himself, but having him be sort of like the emotional heart of like this trio, and having him have this journey with those rings, and like how love can sometimes turn into obsession and negative things, but also if he is able to like find balance within himself, that can help him, you know, be more open to other people. And then with Caro, you know, some people's favorite gift, but like I just had the idea of like, what if she had a baseball bat that fixed everything that it broke? And Caro was already a character who dealt with a lot of anger issues. I don't have a sister, but I have a brother, and my brother also dealt with anger issues as a child. And the more I talked to my brother and my cousins about, you know, how it was for them growing up and going to high school, and I thought about things differently from like my perspective. Like, yes, my brother had anger issues, but also he would like get bullied at school. His name is Diego. He would get called like "Go Diego Go." He would get called like Obama in school because he was only a Black kid. So, you know, things like that. You know, especially with already on top of like toxic masculinity and like machismo. you have to sort of like have empathy for these characters and like just like figure out what would lead to like that change, like you were saying, that flip to the end, and where are they at the start of the book and where are they at the end. And that's something that I was kind of thinking very intentionally about with what I selected for like each of their magical properties, and also how those like magics all like come together by the end of the book. But yeah.
Love all of that. For me, character actually always comes first, even though, write epic fantasy. For The Tiger at Midnight, I actually came up with the opening scene more than anything, and I was traveling and I was at a fort, and I looked out and I just thought, what if I were what if I were a soldier in ancient history in this fort? What is the one thing I would see that would stop me in my tracks? And the answer came really quickly, and the answer was a girl. So then, the love story between Kunal and Isha and The Tiger at Midnight kind of unfolded from there. And the world was built around them, for better or worse. But yeah, so it's really interesting to hear how everyone approaches this so differently.
Yeah.
That's a great way to end it. Thank you all. Thanks for being here.